Venice is a state whose entire deal can be explained by one classical element: water. The ancient city is smack in the middle of a lagoon and 75% canals by volume, while its entire existence abroad was similarly aquatic. Venice made its money sailing across the Mediterranean to trade goods, its power lay in an unmatched navy and the best castle moat in the world, and its territory extended along a chain of island outposts from the Adriatic to the Black Sea. The medieval history of Venice is a game of having as little land as necessary to support an empire made of water. From the city's quasi-mythic founding in the 400s AD through its Byzantine-busting conquest of the Aegean Sea in the 1200s, this was the strat, and Venice played it excellently. But as the centuries rolled on, Venice found the board shifting around them. Expanding trade routes through the Alps meant Central Europe was getting rich enough to actually pay some attention, and by 1349 they'd spun up a state enterprise trading Greek sweet wine for English wool, ferrying that to Flanders to fashion into cloaks, and selling those as far as the Levant. A nifty circuit. New opportunity was first to catch the Venetian eye, but the real shift in strategy spawned from good old danger. Venice had been cresting the limit of how many people it could house and feed in its little lagoon, but there's no wake-up call quite like getting double besieged. Long tangent short, in 1379 their arch-rival Genoa blockaded Venice by land and sea in hopes of destroying their nemesis forever, and they got unsettlingly close. So having unlocked a thrilling new nightmare to panic about, Venice would not let that happen again, and that required something the sea did not and could not give them. The Republic needed a mainland. Unthinkable, I know, but after running the hell away from Italy 1,000 years prior and staying quite firmly out, this new era demanded new strategies. New markets, more space, more food, and as much buffer between them and their enemies as Venice could possibly claw out. Now, technically Venice already held the city of Treviso on and off in the 1300s, but that clearly wasn't cutting it, so they needed more. Thus, the grand reversal of a 1,000-year-long strategy. Back to terraferma they went, and with gusto. This province was known to the Romans as Venetia, and in the Venetian language, which I totally know how to pronounce, Veneto. And here, at long last, they'd claim their namesake region. But then, what even is Venice away from the sea? What does it become when plonked on solid dirt? How does a Venetian cope when bright green fields stretch out forever instead of wine-dark waves? Well, as the next 4 centuries show, they handled it great, and the Republic thrived with a new home on land. So, to see how Venice pulled off their mainland pivot and trace the surprising ways it changed and saved the Republic, twice, let's do some history. Now, Venice liked its conquests like it likes its boats. Fast. That's how they did it in the Aegean after the Fourth Crusade, and that's how they'd play it here. Sweeping across the Po River Valley to the banks of Lake Garda in a year thanks to a skill called exploiting other people's bad luck. See, in the late 1300s, the Scaligeri, lords of Verona, fought neighboring Padova to exhaustion, so Milan swept in to conquer Verona outright in 1388. But here's where it gets exciting for good old Vembus. In 1402, the Duke of Milan suddenly died, leaving the now rudderless city racked by infighting at home and dangerously overextended. Padova swiftly moved to fill the vacuum, so Milan was desperate enough to cut a deal. If Venice rid them of Padova and its meddlesome Carraresi family, they could keep Verona for the trouble, plus nearby Vicenza too. With the border raid as deliciously stealable as they could ever hope for, the Republic had its mission. Get it. Quick as that process was, it was not cheap. The cost of mobilizing an army from all corners of the Republic came out to roughly 10% of the state's annual GDP for every month on campaign. But after the surrender of Verona and Vicenza in 1404, then finally Padova in 1405, Venice had eliminated 2 rivals on its doorstep and gotten nearly everything it wanted out of a mainland state. Alps access, fertile farmlands, urban space, and a giant land buffer on top of their giant moat. Check, 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 and check. A quarter century later, this Stato da Terra had nearly doubled, reaching from Aquileia into Lombardia. Of course, the victory haul of everything they ever wanted and more had a cost greater than mere money, as Venice had sacrificed the luxury of distance and was now firmly committed to playing the game of Italian geopolitics forever. We'll see how that unfolds before long, but let's take a look at the cities themselves to see what Venice found in its new domains. Likely the most visible shock was architecture, as Venice had been raised on a strict diet of Eastern Mediterranean aesthetics, whereas the mainland was hard at work developing the Gothic style. Padova had recently finished a masterpiece basilica for their hometown St. Anthony, showing just how much extra height you can get from using pointy arches instead of round ones. As a counterpoint to the Byzantine glitz of St. Mark's Basilica, Padova sported a new and novel style. Meanwhile, Verona's old Scaligeri lords had whipped up a gorgeous set of tombs in the city, taking the ornamentation of Gothic as far as their chisels would carry them. All these influences found their way back to Venice, inspiring taller spaces and bold new decorations in the fusion of Byzantine, Islamic, and mainland European styles that we call Venetian Gothic. Inventive as it was, this felt right at home home in the lagoon since it was totally allergic to moderation, going all in on lavish details. The citizens of Verona would have been impressed to see their city's tombs as the soft influence for the processional entryway to the Doge's palace, as well as the far more direct model for the crockets atop St. Mark's Basilica. Scarcely 50 years after the mainland pivot, and the heart of Venice was reflecting this new world. And not to put too fine a point on it, but the mainland is also the reason Venice got the Renaissance, as they entered the Italian art world right when artists were breaking out of the medieval mold to play with composition, color, space, perspective, and posing. Right at the start of the 1300s in Padova, the artist Giotto took an early step towards Renaissance naturalism with the Scrovegni Chapel, painting familiar Bible scenes in fully realized environments, striving for dynamism and emotion in his characters. Clearly, Venice was a fan, as they imported mainland artists to fresco up the Doge's palace after 1400. Fast forward to the 1500s, and the Venetian Renaissance bore the masterpieces of Titian, Tintoretto, and countless other brilliant painters. That same century, the third jolt to the Venetian aesthetic also sprung from the mainland, as Vicenza's Andrea Palladio looked to classical models when designing villas, civic buildings, and church facades. Before long, the lagoon was sporting Palladian visions as the design language for new churches and a really elegant way to handle running facades like the ones on St. Mark's Square. But one angle on Palladio that's easy to skip over, don't look at me like that, is his focus on villas, because it represents the arrival of the Republic's aristocracy in a completely new context. No longer a state entirely of seafaring merchants, but increasingly one of landowners who wanted to retain a Venetian elegance away from the comfy canals of home. This new lifestyle was hardly as exciting as setting sail for distant shores, but far more consistent against a rapidly changing economy, for Ottoman and Spain-shaped reasons we'll see in a minute. Palladio's architecture remade the face of Vicenza and inspired the rest of the Republic, but it's also emblematic of how the Republic in turn transformed its mainland cities. At first, this was quick and efficient. Venice takes a city, throws in a winged lion on a big column, bingo, Vembus in charge. But as the centuries went on, the mainland cities built public and civic works in the image of and in service of the Republic. In the 14 and 1500s, Padova got a new clock tower, which inspired the iconic clock tower in St. Mark's Square, as well as a new home base for the long-standing University of Padova in the gorgeous double-colonnaded Palazzo Bo. First founded in 1222 as an offshoot of the University of Bologna, Padova's university was the second oldest in Italy, and during the Venetian era, it was the only place where the Republic's nobility could study, lest they be corrupted from learning in icky foreign lands and come back home thinking monarchy is cool. Gross. In return, Venice granted the university immense academic freedom, so they gladly welcomed foreigners, and once the distinction became relevant, even Protestants. That permissive attitude extended into the studies themselves, as famed scientists Galileo and Copernicus both spent time at the University of Padova, with Galileo describing his time teaching there as the best 18 years of my life. I'm sure it at least beat house arrest. So, with the arrival of the Republic on terraferma, Venice became more like the mainland, and the cities of the Veneto became more like the lagoon. After a millennium spent looking firmly east and doing its best to ignore the giant peninsula directly behind it, Venice was finally becoming Italian. But for all the benefits to grand strategy and pretty culture, being an Italian state meant all of your neighbors constantly wish you dead. Unfortunately for La Serenissima, Milan finally got its act together, and Venice began the long slog of playing defense. By 1426, Venice had pushed past Lake Garda to take the city of Brescia, but in 1438, Milan swept east to recapture as far as Verona. Venice might have been new at this, but they weren't about to give up that easily, so the Republic hatched a plan to sail a small fleet up the Adige River, then beach the ships and drag them through the mountains to plonk them in the north of the lake and sail down to surprise Milan's fleet. That's insane! Venice pulled Hannibal strats with boats! But even worse, it worked! Venice beat Milan, retook Brescia and Verona in 1440, and proved that the Republic, which bested the Byzantines, wasn't afraid of their land-loving neighbors. God, they're so fucking cool! Tranquillo, Blue, tranquillo. This period of relative peace lasted until 1508, when a Genoa-born pope chose violence, inviting Germany and France into an alliance of friendship, fun, and murdering Venice. It didn't work as planned, partly because that pope was an idiot who panicked when the foreign armies he invited showed up to his peninsula and looked a lot scarier in person, so he swiftly allied with Venice to repel the invaders. Then Venice completed the circuit by allying with France against the pope to claw back its original borders. To make a long pope fight short, Venice kept its beloved terraferma, this time for good, but its cities and countryside suffered mightily in the shuffle. Now, agonizing as that war had been, the following century would prove much more perilous, as the very foundation of its power was threatened from the east and the far, far west. First was the Ottoman menace, who, having toppled the Byzantines on land, now resolved to kick Venice out of their pond. By the end of the century, Venice lost Cyprus and nearly all their Aegean holdings, and the 1600s saw the extra painful fall of Crete. Rough, but survivable, as Venice was a trade powerhouse before it held those islands, and it could remain one after, except for a very big rock on the opposite side of the Atlantic Ocean, as Spain began colonizing the New World while Portugal sailed underneath Africa to reach Asia, opening two massive new markets to the world and leaving the Republic's old trade routes too expensive and too dangerous to bother with. Naval power? Poof. Trade monopoly? Also poof. Uh-oh, Vembis. Not looking good. Europe's pivot to the Atlantic while the Ottomans munched on the Med is the kind of 1-2 punch that would have sunk medieval Venice during its aqua-only heyday. But the Republic of the Renaissance era was on much different footing, no longer the lone master of the seas nor fabulously rich, but in command of a stable terra firma. So as Venice shifted focus to things it could make in-house, luxury goods like glass and lace, plus becoming the dominant player in Europe's burgeoning bookmaking industry, the Veneto provided steady income, consistent food, plenty of space, and a vital buffer for the lagoon, more valuable here in the latter centuries than Venice could have ever imagined back in 1400. Without the myriad benefits of the mainland, Venice could have easily hit game over centuries ahead of schedule. Having a mainland is objectively the most normal thing Venice ever did, but the way they handled it and the effect it had on their culture is so darn weird it could only be Venice. Each city in the Stato da Terra built upon the Venetian identity, in Gothic and neoclassical architecture, in educating the citizens, in producing luxury goods like silk, books, and violins, and in building the Renaissance itself. All icons of Venice owing massively to the mainland. And despite all this being on solid grounds, the way they got and kept it is classic them, winning territory through crafty diplomacy and keeping it through the most bonkers strategies imaginable. What sane state would lose a major city for the first time and immediately think, I've got an idea, let's wheel a fleet of ships through the mountains to drop them in a lake? So, what have we learned? You can take Venetians off the boats, but you can't take the boats out of Venice. 'Cause you know, they're 100 miles inland in the lake. Thank you for watching. I recently had the joy of visiting Venice and the Veneto with Cyan, Red, and a few of our very close friends, so not only does Red finally understand firsthand why I'll never be normal about Venice, but I feel like I really got to see the Veneto as a cohesive unit, and, of course, take a buttload of photos. I'm no professional, but your boy Blue can shoot a mean rule of thirds.